Sakachi 1. Some stories refuse to stay where they belong. They don't end when the news cycle moves on. They don't settle even years later when the noise fades and only fragments remain. This is one of those stories. A plane takes off in the ordinary way. Nothing dramatic, nothing unusual. People settle into seats, lights dim. Engines hum with that familiar, almost comforting rhythm. And then, quietly, without warning, the story slips away from what we understand. Not with an explosion, not with a clear mistake, but with absence, radar gaps, unanswered calls, conflicting timelines, pieces of information that don't quite fit together, no matter how patiently you turn them over. Tonight isn't about solving anything. It's about sitting with what remains unclear, about listening to the spaces between official statements, about noticing what still feels unfinished even now. Let your attention slow. There's no rush here. The night didn't begin with mystery. It began the way so many nights do in airports, with routines that feel almost automatic once you've been around them long enough. Floors reflecting overhead lights, soft announcements echoing without urgency, people moving because they are told to move, sitting because they are told to sit, trusting that the system knows where they are going. This flight was not late. It was not surrounded by concern. There were no raised voices or hurried steps. For the crew, it was another scheduled departure. A route that had been flown before, a sequence of checklists that had been completed thousands of times across countless flights, switches verified, instruments checked, everything appearing exactly where it should be. Passengers boarded with the quiet resignation that comes with long-haul travel, some already tired, some restless, some distracted by screens glowing in their laps, a few perhaps nervous but not unusually so. Nothing about this night suggested it would be remembered. There is something important about that normality, because when people later search for meaning, they often look for warning signs. They look for moments that feel charged or different. But most events that change history do not announce themselves. They arrive dressed as routine. The cabin doors closed, the plane pushed back. Engines came alive with that low, steady sound that blends into the background after a while, almost like breathing. At this point, nothing separates this flight from thousands of others moving through the sky at the same hour, in different countries, over different oceans, each one carrying his own small world of people, unaware of one another. Air travel depends on trust, not blind trust, but layered trust. Pilots trust their instruments, controllers trust their screens, passengers trust both without ever seeing most of it. This trust is built slowly over time, reinforced by repetition. Flights that land safely erase the memory of flights that could have gone wrong. Normal outcomes teach us that normal is reliable, and that's why, when something later breaks that expectation, the mind struggles to accept it. As the aircraft climbed, communication flowed as expected. Short, professional exchanges, no emotion, no deviation, just confirmation, acknowledgement, handoff. Each voice doing exactly what it was trained to do. To an outside listener, these transmissions would sound almost dull. That's the point. Calm communication is a sign that nothing demands attention. Somewhere inside the cockpit, there would have been quiet concentration. Not silence, but focus. Adjustments made without comment. Familiar motions repeated in practice order. Behind the cockpit door, the cabin would have settled. Lights dimming slightly, the subtle shift in sound as the aircraft reached cruising altitude. That moment when the body relaxes and the mind drifts, knowing there are hours ahead with nothing required of you. People fall asleep in pieces. First the shoulders soften, then the neck, then thought slows. And outside the plane moved into darkness. Over the ocean night is different. There are no city lights below, no reference points, just a black surface that reflects almost nothing back. Above, the sky can feel larger, more distant, as if the stars are watching rather than guiding. This is where systems matter most. When there is nothing to see, you rely entirely on instruments, procedures, and communication. You trust that every handoff is logged, every signal received, every position known. Most of the time, that trust is rewarded. But the systems that keep aviation safe are not a single thing. They are many overlapping layers. And when layers interact, small gaps can appear without being noticed. Not failures, just spaces. At this stage of the flight, nothing had gone missing. Nothing had stopped responding. There was no alarm, No deviation announced, no reason for concern. The aircraft existed exactly where it was expected to exist. That expectation is powerful. Once a flight is handed off from one airspace to another, responsibility shifts quietly. One controller steps back, another steps in. A seamless exchange that happens countless times every day, and most of the time, nobody thinks about it again. Later, people would replay these moments. They would slow them down, examine the phrasing, the timing, the sequence. They would search for hints of hesitation, or stress, or something unsaid. But in real time, there was nothing to interpret, only routine. What makes this unsettling is not what happened in these early moments, but what did not happen. No distress call, no abrupt change, no signal that demanded immediate response. Absence doesn't announce itself. It slips in quietly, often going unnoticed until someone looks back and realizes there is a gap where continuity should have been. At this point in the story, the flight is still a flight, still accounted for, still moving forward. No one is searching yet. No one is worried yet. And that matters because once concern enters a story, it reshapes everything that follows. But here, we are still before that moment. Still inside expectation. The night continues, unaware that it will soon be defined by what it fails to explain. Somewhere between routine and record-keeping, the flight passed from one system into another. This handoff is designed to be forgettable. It happens so often that it barely registers as an event. A voice says a call sign. Another voice answers. Responsibility moves from one controller to the next, and the aircraft continues forward, unchanged. In most cases, nothing more needs to be said. What makes this moment worth lingering on is not that it was unusual, but that it was so ordinary that it vanished into procedure. Later, people would try to anchor the story here, as if a precise second could explain everything. But in real time, there was no such feeling. No sense of weight or consequence. The aircraft crossed into a new region of airspace. A new set of eyes, new screens, new expectations. And then, quietly, something stopped being received. Not all at once. Not dramatically. There was no alarm sounding, no flashing warning demanding attention, just a silence where a response should have been. The kind of silence that can easily be dismissed as delay, interference, or routine misalignment. Controllers are trained not to panic at the first sign of missing information. Systems lag. Signals drop. Planes continue on predictable paths even when contact is briefly lost. These things happen, and most of the time they resolve themselves without incident, so time passes. Minutes matter in retrospect, but they rarely feel urgent while they're happening. A few seconds stretch. A minute becomes two. Someone waits for a reply that should arrive any moment. When it doesn't, the mind offers explanations, technical reasons, environmental interference, human timing differences, all reasonable, all familiar. There is a difference between concern and recognition. Concern asks, is something wrong? Recognition asks, something has changed. Recognition usually comes later. During this stretch of time, the aircraft is still assumed to be flying normally. Its projected path continues forward on screens based on last known data. The system fills in gaps automatically, trusting continuity because continuity has always been reliable. This is how disappearance begins in modern systems. Not with vanishing, but with assumption. A plane does not simply stop existing when communication ceases. It is believed to be where it should be, doing what it should be doing until proven otherwise. And proof takes time. Behind the scenes, small checks begin. Not emergencies, just verifications. A second call, a repeated attempt, a note made, perhaps without urgency. Meanwhile, passengers are unaware. Whatever silence exists between systems does not exist inside the cabin. The aircraft continues its steady motion. Engines hum, air flows, lights remain low. If anyone is awake, they are thinking about personal things. A destination, a meeting, a reunion. Sleep comes and goes in fragments. There is something unsettling about how separate these experiences are. The inner world of the cabin and the outer world of control exist almost independently. One can drift while the other begins to notice something is missing. As minutes pass without confirmation, the absence becomes harder to ignore. Not alarming yet, but noticeable. Enough to prompt questions that are still procedural, still calm. Has the frequency changed? Is the aircraft already with the next controller? Was the handoff logged correctly? Each question assumes normality. Each one delays the moment when someone has to consider something else. This is not negligence. It is how systems are designed to avoid overreaction. False alarms are dangerous in their own way. The balance between vigilance and restraint is delicate. Eventually, someone looks more closely. Not urgently, just attentively. A path that should align no longer does. A response that should have come has not. This is where the story begins to feel different, but not yet frightening. Not yet. There is still time to believe this will resolve itself. Still time to assume the missing piece will reappear and the night will continue unnoticed. But the longer silence lasts, the heavier it becomes. And once silence carries weight, it is no longer just absence. It is information. By the time anyone seriously noticed something was wrong, the night had already moved on. That detail matters more than it seems. The world doesn't pause when uncertainty enters a system. Flights continue elsewhere. Controllers keep speaking to other aircraft. Logs keep filling with ordinary information. Whatever silence existed around this one flight had to compete with the noise of everything else still functioning. At first, the missing response felt technical. A skipped beat in a familiar rhythm. Controllers are trained to expect these moments. Radios fail briefly. Signals blur. Frequencies overlap. The sky is crowded with invisible traffic, and perfection is never assumed. So another call was made, then another. Still calm. Still professional. Still framed as routine. The aircraft was expected to be moving steadily forward, following a path calculated long before takeoff. Nothing suggested it had deviated. No warning indicated distress. In aviation, those absences carry meaning of their own. A distressed aircraft is loud. It announces trouble urgently. Silence suggests something else entirely. As minutes passed, the silence stopped feeling like interference and began to feel like delay. A subtle shift. Not enough to alarm, but enough to slow the room slightly. Attention lingered longer on the same screen. Someone checked the timing of the handoff. Another reviewed recent transmissions. Everything before the gap looked ordinary. Too ordinary to explain why nothing followed. This is where human systems reveal their limits. Technology can tell you what it receives. It cannot explain why it receives nothing. That interpretation falls to people, and people rely on patterns they've seen before. And before this night, planes that vanished without trace were not part of the modern pattern. Search and rescue procedures do not activate instantly. There are thresholds, confirmations that must fail before concern escalates. The system is built this way to avoid chaos, to prevent every brief disruption from becoming an emergency. But that design also means there is a quiet window where something can be wrong without being treated as wrong yet. During that window, the aircraft still existed on projections, mathematical ghosts, moving forward based on last known speed and direction. A reasonable assumption, a necessary one. Somewhere, a controller likely assumed the aircraft had already switched to another frequency. Somewhere else, someone assumed the same thing in reverse, each assumption harmless on its own. Together, they created a gap. When someone finally tried to verify the aircraft's position through alternative means, the answers came back incomplete. Not alarming, just thin. No confirmed contact, no updated data. Nothing that clearly said danger, but nothing that restored certainty either. Uncertainty is uncomfortable in operational environments. It doesn't fit neatly into procedures. It lingers waiting for context. At this stage, no one imagined disappearance. That word carries too much weight. It suggests intention, drama, finality. None of those fit what they were seeing. Instead, the thinking stayed grounded, conservative. Maybe the aircraft was still flying, but out of reach. Maybe systems weren't synced correctly. Maybe the issue would resolve itself once the plane reached its destination. There is a quiet optimism built into routine. Planes are expected to arrive. Meanwhile, passengers remained unaware. The cabin environment would have been unchanged. No announcements, no shift in tone. The aircraft doesn't respond to concern outside it. It continues until something inside tells it not to. That separation between inside and outside is unsettling to think about now. Two realities moving forward at once. One growing uncertain, one still intact. As more time passed, concern finally crossed an internal line. Not panic, not fear, but acknowledgement. Something had not returned when it should have. At that point, checks became more deliberate. Calls were made beyond the immediate control area. Data was reviewed more carefully. The assumption of continuity began to weaken. Yet even then, the possibility that the aircraft was simply delayed, misrouted, or temporarily unreachable remained dominant. Modern aviation had earned that trust. It takes time for belief to break. What complicated matters further was the absence of contradiction. There was no crash signal, no emergency beacon, no debris, nothing to replace the missing information with something else. Silence persisted without explanation. This is where narratives begin to form, not because people want drama, but because the mind dislikes empty space. When data disappears, interpretation rushes in to fill it. Still, official thinking remained restrained. The language stayed careful. No declarations, no conclusions, just acknowledgement that contact had not been established. Families were not informed yet. The word missing had not been spoken publicly. Internally, the situation hovered between delay and concern, between expectation and doubt. Outside the control rooms, the night remained quiet. Rain fell in places far from the aircraft's path. Cities slept. The world continued without knowing it had lost something. That contrast is difficult to sit with, a plane full of people becoming uncertain while life elsewhere remains unchanged. Eventually, when the aircraft failed to arrive where it should have, uncertainty hardened into something heavier. Not yet tragedy, but no longer routine. By then, hours had passed. And hours change the shape of every story, because once time stretches beyond expectation, silence is no longer neutral. It becomes a question that cannot be ignored. And the longer it remains unanswered, the more unsettling every possible answer becomes. As the expected arrival time came and went, the situation crossed into a different mental space, not officially at first, but emotionally. Schedules are promises even when no one calls them that, and arrival time suggests continuity. It is deeps that the invisible work of navigation, fuel planning, and coordination is unfolding exactly as designed. When that promise is missed, the mind doesn't jump straight to catastrophe. It hesitates. It searches for ordinary explanations that still fit. Delays happen. Weather intervenes. Aircraft circle. Gates change. These are familiar disruptions, and familiarity softens concern. But this was not a delay that announced itself. No update arrived to explain the absence. No revised estimate appeared. Just the quiet fact that something expected had not occurred. At this point, internal conversations changed tone, not outwardly. Voices remained measured, procedures remained orderly. But attention narrowed. The flight stopped being one among many and became a focal point. Search and rescue protocols do not begin with urgency alone. They begin with confirmation that absence is real, that nothing else accounts for it. This takes time, and that time can feel unsettling later when replayed in hindsight. Checks expanded outward, adjacent airspaces were contacted. Military radar data was quietly referenced, not because anyone suspected something extreme, but because broader systems sometimes see what civilian ones miss. What came back was incomplete. There were hints, fragments, suggestions of movement that didn't align cleanly with the expected path, data that could be interpreted in more than one way, enough to complicate the picture, not enough to clarify it. This is where uncertainty deepens rather than resolves. When information is partial, every interpretation feels tentative. One explanation seems reasonable until another fits just as well. Without contradiction, nothing can be ruled out. At some point, the language changed internally. Not dramatically, just a shift from not confirmed to unable to establish contact. Words chosen carefully, aware of their weight. The possibility that the aircraft was no longer reachable began to be considered, even if no one wanted to say why. Outside these rooms, families were still unaware. People were waiting at the destination airport, watching arrival boards, assuming a delay would soon be explained. A few may have checked phones. A few may have grown mildly irritated. No one imagined what was unfolding behind closed doors. There is a cruelty in that gap, even if unintended. Knowledge moving slower than expectation. Concern building where hope still exists. As the hours passed, the absence of emergency signals became more troubling, not less. Modern aircraft are designed to speak when something goes wrong, to leave traces, to announce distress, even when human voices cannot. That none had appeared suggested a situation outside familiar patterns. This did not lead to conclusions. It led to restraint. Authorities are careful with first statements for a reason. Once words are spoken publicly, they cannot be pulled back. Premature certainty can cause harm of its own. So the early messaging stayed sparse, vague, correct but incomplete. The aircraft had not arrived. Contact had not been established. Efforts were underway to gather information. Each sentence true, none satisfying. Meanwhile, the search area began to expand conceptually. Without a confirmed last position, the mind must work backward and outward at the same time. Fuel estimates were revisited, possible routes considered, deviations imagined without evidence to support them. This is exhausting work, not physically, but cognitively. Holding many possibilities without favoring one too early requires discipline. Night gave way to morning in some places. News outlets began to notice the absence. Early reports were cautious, repeating official language without interpretation. Still, the story had entered public awareness. Once that happens, the pressure changes. Questions arrive faster than answers can be formed. The absence of information begins to feel like information itself. Silence becomes suspicious, even when it is procedural. Internally, the understanding hardened. This was no longer a routine delay. Something significant had occurred, even if its nature remained unknown. And yet, there was still hope. Hope does not disappear all at once. It narrows gradually, from confident expectation to cautious optimism, from optimism to quiet possibility. Search efforts began to organize more visibly. Assets were identified, regions prioritized, not because certainty had been reached, but because uncertainty could no longer be allowed to drift. Every hour that passed without resolution changed the emotional temperature of the situation. What had once felt technical now felt human. The awareness that people were aboard, waiting for answers they would never hear. This is the moment when stories begin to diverge. Official processes move forward deliberately. Public imagination moves faster, filling gaps with speculation, fear, and unfinished thoughts. These two movements rarely align, and the space between them grows tense. By the end of this period, the aircraft was no longer simply unresponsive. It was missing. That word carries gravity. It suggests not just absence, but separation from understanding, a break in continuity that no system had anticipated. And once something is missing, it invites questions that may never settle. Before anyone tried to explain what might have happened, they tried to understand where the aircraft could have been. That distinction matters. Explanation comes later. Location comes first. You can't ask why until you know where to look, and in this case, even that basic anchor was missing. Radar is often imagined as a single, all-seeing system, a clean sweep across a screen that catches everything in motion. In reality, it's layered, uneven, and shaped by geography, jurisdiction, and purpose. Civilian radar sees one kind of information, military radar sees another. Some systems record continuously, others do not. What exists is not a perfect picture, but overlapping fragments. As investigators began to review available data, they found traces that complicated the story rather than clarifying it. Points of contact that appeared and disappeared. Signals that suggested movement beyond the expected path. Nothing solid enough to stand on, but too consistent to ignore entirely. This is where the narrative begins to bend. The idea that the aircraft simply vanished along its planned route became harder to sustain. Something, somewhere, suggested a deviation. Not dramatic. Not abrupt. Just enough of a shift to raise questions. But questions built on partial data are fragile. Radar returns can be misread. Reflections bounce. Signals overlap. Old data can appear new. New data can be incomplete. Every point on a screen demands interpretation. And interpretation always carries uncertainty. Some of the data came from systems not designed for civilian tracking. They were meant to tell a story, only to alert operators to presence, direction without intention, movement without context. This created a strange situation. There may have been information available, but it wasn't information that fit cleanly into the narrative people expected. Instead of a straight line, the path seemed to curve. Instead of forward motion alone, there were hints of change, not enough to confirm, but enough to unsettle the assumption that nothing unusual had occurred before contact was lost. Investigators had to decide how much weight to give these hints. Too much, and they risked chasing noise. Too little, and they risked missing the only clues available. This balance is difficult, especially early on, when pressure is high and clarity is low. As different agencies reviewed the same information, interpretations diverged, not because anyone was careless, but because the data allowed for it. One reading suggested continued flight in an unexpected direction. Another suggested system artifacts. Both were plausible, and plausibility without confirmation is exhausting. Meanwhile, public awareness grew. Once reports of possible deviation surfaced, even cautiously, attention sharpened. The idea that the aircraft may have changed course introduced a sense of intention into the story. Whether justified or not, intention is powerful. It shifts how people listen. It makes absence feel less accidental. Official communication remained careful. Statements acknowledged ongoing analysis without endorsing specific interpretations. Saki 2. This restraint, while responsible, created space for speculation to grow elsewhere. Silence from authority rarely stays empty for long. Within investigative circles, discussions became more complex. If the aircraft had deviated, when had that occurred? Before or after communication was lost? Gradually or suddenly? And most importantly, why? But asking why too early can distort how evidence is read. Investigators know this. They try to resist narrative gravity, the pull towards stories that feel complete. Still, humans think in stories, even professionals. The radar data did not offer closure. It offered possibility, and possibility can be unsettling when lives are involved. At the same time, the absence of distress signals remained unresolved. A deliberate change in course would suggest awareness. Awareness would suggest opportunity to communicate. And yet, there had been none. This contradiction sat at the center of the emerging mystery. If something had gone wrong suddenly, deviation seemed unlikely. If deviation was intentional, silence seemed harder to explain. Both ideas existed at once, uncomfortable companions. As search planning began to incorporate these uncertainties, the scope expanded. Areas previously considered unlikely now demanded attention. The ocean, already vast, grew larger still. Search resources are finite. Every expansion comes at a cost. Decisions had to be made based on incomplete confidence, knowing that choosing one direction meant not choosing another. This is where hindsight becomes cruel. Later, people would ask why certain areas were prioritized and others were not. They would assume clarity existed when it did not. They would forget how thin the information was at the time. In the moment, every choice felt provisional. Radar does not tell you what happened. It tells you what might have been there. And in this case, even that was uncertain. What remained undeniable was that the aircraft was no longer where it should have been. The expected path no longer held. The story could no longer move forward in a straight line. Instead, it branched. And once a story branches, it rarely returns to simplicity. The investigation was no longer just about locating a missing plane. It was about reconciling systems that disagreed, data that resisted alignment, and assumptions that no longer felt safe. This is where modern mystery takes shape, not through darkness or drama, but through conflicting signals that refuse to settle. The night had taken something ordinary and made it ambiguous. And ambiguity, once introduced, has a way of lingering far longer than certainty ever does. As radar interpretations circulated quietly between agencies, another form of data began to take on more weight than anyone expected. It wasn't designed for storytelling. It wasn't even designed for emergencies. It was simply there, running in the background, doing what it always did. Modern aircraft exchange brief automated signals with satellites. These signals aren't conversations. They don't say where a plane is going or why. They are closer to a digital handshake, a confirmation that something is powered, responsive, still part of the system. For a long time, this kind of data was considered unremarkable, useful for maintenance, useful for billing, not something people leaned on during crises. But when so many other signals were missing, these quiet acknowledgements began to matter. They suggested that long after voice communication ended, the aircraft may still have been functioning, not broadcasting distress, not requesting distress, not requesting help, just existing. This idea unsettled investigators, because existence without communication raises difficult questions. It suggests time. It suggests continuity. It suggests that whatever happened did not happen all at once. These satellite exchanges did not reveal location directly, they revealed presence. And presence without context can be harder to interpret than absence. Each time one of these signals was logged, It quietly extended the possible timeline. It implied that the aircraft had remained airborne beyond the moment when many assumed the story had ended. But again, interpretation mattered. Could these signals be misread? Could they originate from something else? Could they persist without meaningful activity on board? Experts debated carefully, often in private. Public statements remained measured, acknowledging analysis without committing to conclusions. The difficulty wasn't skepticism, it was humility. These systems were never meant to answer the questions now being asked of them. Over time, patterns were proposed, arcs rather than points, possible corridors of movement rather than locations, broad, unsettling shapes drawn across maps that stretched into empty ocean. The farther these shapes reached, the quieter the world beneath them became. This shift changed the emotional gravity of the search. Early efforts had focused to near-known routes, places where rescue felt imaginable. These new possibilities pointed toward regions defined more by scale than access. Oceans do not offer feedback easily. They absorb sound. They conceal debris. They stretch attention thin. As these interpretations became part of planning, skepticism followed. Not denial, but caution. Entire search strategies would depend on trusting data, never meant for navigation. Yet ignoring it felt equally dangerous. Investigators found themselves choosing between imperfect tools. Each choice came with risk. Each risk carried consequence. Public reaction grew more complicated. The idea that the aircraft may have flown for hours without contact challenged earlier assumptions. It introduced a sense of time passing unnoticed, a period where outcomes could have changed, where intervention might have been possible. This is where frustration enters. People want moments, points where things could have gone differently. They want to believe that clarity existed and was missed, but clarity rarely announces itself in real time. What these satellite signals truly offered was not answers, but expansion. The story grew larger, heavier, harder to contain. What began as a missing aircraft near a known route became a mystery spanning vast distances. The absence of debris reinforced this discomfort. If the aircraft had gone down quickly, something might have surfaced. But prolonged flight suggested a different ending, one that pushed the final moment farther away, deeper into places rarely observed. Even so, investigators resisted firm conclusions. They spoke in probabilities, in confidence ranges, in language that acknowledged uncertainty without surrendering to it. That restraint, while responsible, felt unsatisfying to many. Silence invites interpretation, and interpretation, once shared, multiplies. Outside official channels, theories began to form. Some grounded, some speculative, most driven by the same need to replace uncertainty with narrative. Inside official circles, the mood remained cautious. Every new interpretation had to survive scrutiny. Every assumption had to be challenged before it hardened. Because once a theory becomes public, it reshapes expectation. And reshaped expectations can mislead future searches. The satellite data did not close the mystery. It deepened it. It suggested endurance without direction, movement without voice. A plane still present but unreachable. And that idea is profoundly unsettling. It implies not disappearance, but isolation. Not instant loss, but prolonged uncertainty. As this understanding settled, search efforts adjusted again. Resources shifted. Maps redrew themselves. The search area stretched farther into places defined less by traffic and more by emptiness. With each expansion, the probability of recovery thinned. Not because hope vanished, but because scale overwhelms precision. By the end of this period, one thing had become clear. Whatever had happened, it did not fit comfortably into known categories. Not mechanical failure alone. Not sudden catastrophe alone. Not something aviation systems were practiced at explaining. The data spoke softly, and it spoke incompletely. And the more carefully people listened, the more they realized how much remained unsaid. As the search widened and the data grew quieter rather than clearer, attention turned inward toward the aircraft itself. Not toward what might have happened at the end, but toward what the plane was capable of doing while everything else went silent. Commercial aircraft are not simple machines. They are layered environments, redundant systems stacked on top of one another, designed so that a single failure does not become a catastrophe. When something stops responding, it usually does so loudly. Alerts trigger. Messages are sent. Records are made. That is what made this silence difficult to place. investigators began to look carefully at communication systems on board, not just radios, but everything that allowed the aircraft to announce itself to the world. Systems that speak automatically, systems that require human input, systems that fail independently, and systems that fail together. Each one told a slightly different story. Voice communication had ended first. That was clear. But voice is fragile by design. It depends on timing, frequency, coordination. Losing it does not mean losing control. Other systems were more stubborn. They persisted longer, quietly, indifferently, continuing to send simple acknowledgements without context. This raised an uncomfortable possibility. That silence was not the result of sudden failure, because sudden failures tend to be messy. They leave traces. They generate errors. They interrupt everything at once. What appeared here was more selective. Some systems stopped, others continued. The pattern suggested separation rather than collapse. That does not automatically imply intention. Systems can fail in sequence. Electrical events can cascade in uneven ways. Human actions can have unintended effects. But it did force investigators to widen their thinking beyond the familiar. Could communication have been disrupted without disabling flight? Could systems have been altered without triggering alarms? Could something have unfolded slowly enough that automated safeguards never escalated? These questions were not accusations. They were boundaries of possibility. Modern aviation rarely encounters events that fall outside its prepared explanations. When it does, language becomes cautious. Words like unlikely and theoretically possible begin to appear. Investigators had to consider scenarios they were trained not to prioritize, not because those scenarios were likely, but because nothing else fit cleanly. Meanwhile, the absence of distress signals remained unresolved. Emergency beacons are designed to activate under extreme conditions. Impact, rapid deceleration, certain types of failure. The silence suggested that whatever ended the flight may not have triggered those conditions, or that the triggering never occurred. That distinction matters. If an aircraft descends gradually, if it remains intact longer than expected, if it settles rather than collides, the systems meant to cry out may never do so. This possibility does not offer comfort. It extends uncertainty. As investigators trace power pathways and system dependencies, they found that not all communications are equal. Some can be disabled with surprising simplicity, others resist interference. Understanding which systems went quiet and when became central. But timelines were imprecise, logs incomplete, data scattered across jurisdictions. Reconstructing sequence required inference, and inference is vulnerable to bias. Every investigator knows this. They check one another. They challenge assumptions. They argue gently, methodically, sometimes endlessly, because getting the order wrong changes everything. If systems fail before deviation, one set of explanations makes sense. If deviation came first, a different set emerges. And if both unfolded gradually, overlapping in ways no one had anticipated, the story resists resolution entirely. Outside official analysis, these technical discussions sounded abstract, cold, removed from the human weight of the event. But inside them was an unspoken awareness. People had been aboard during this silence, not knowing, not warned, not hearing alarms. The idea that a plane could move through the night, systems selectively quiet, without signaling distress, unsettled even experienced professionals. It challenged the comforting belief that danger announces itself clearly. As days passed, the lack of wreckage continued to frustrate attempts at certainty. Physical evidence grounds theory. Without it, everything floats. Search teams scanned surfaces, sonar listened below, aircraft flew patterns over empty water. Nothing answered back. The ocean does not confirm or deny. It absorbs. This absence fed speculation, but also restraint. Investigators resisted public conclusions not because they lacked theories, but because they understood how fragile those theories were without confirmation. Every statement was weighed for how it might limit future understanding. As more technical possibilities were considered, one truth became unavoidable. The aircraft did not simply disappear. It transitioned out of view, step by step, system by system. That transition did not align neatly with known failure patterns, nor did it demand a single explanation. It sat in between accident and intention, between system failure and human involvement. between what aviation prepares for and what it hopes never to face. This ambiguity is not satisfying. It offers no resolution, but it reflects reality more honestly than certainty ever could. By this point in the story, the question was no longer only where the aircraft went. It was how something so complex could become so quiet, and why that quiet resisted every attempt to explain it away. As investigators sat with that question, another realization began to surface, slowly and reluctantly. Silence is not a single state. It has layers. There is the silence of systems that are broken, and there is the silence of systems that are no longer being used. Distinguishing between the two is difficult, especially when evidence is incomplete. But it matters because each kind of silence points in a different direction. Technical failures tend to leave signatures, fluctuations, partial signals, error codes, something that suggests struggle. Even when systems fail unevenly, they usually do so under stress, and stress leaves marks. What troubled investigators here was how clean some of the transitions appeared. Not clean in the sense of certainty, clean in the sense of absence without chaos. That doesn't prove intention, but it refuses to rule it out. Commercial aircraft are designed with layers of redundancy, but they are also designed for human control. Pilots can disable certain systems deliberately, often for legitimate reasons. Training includes when and how to do this safely. The question that quietly emerged was not, could someone do this, but under what circumstances would someone need to, and that question has no comfortable answers. Investigators avoided framing it directly for a long time. Publicly, it was approached obliquely, through discussions of system access, through explanations of what is possible, rather than what is probable. This careful language was not evasion, it was respect for uncertainty, because once human action is suggested even tentatively, the story changes shape. It becomes personal. It invites judgment. It demands motive. And motive is a dangerous thing to speculate about without evidence. Still, the possibility lingered. If systems were altered deliberately, it did not happen in a moment of chaos. It would have required time, awareness, control, a situation in which no alarms escalated and no distress was transmitted. That image is unsettling precisely because it is quiet, not a struggle. Not panic, just adjustment. But investigators also knew that unlikely things happen without intention. Electrical anomalies can behave unpredictably. Fires can damage systems selectively. Human responses to unusual failures can have unintended consequences. A pilot responding to one problem can inadvertently create another. That is why no single explanation could be allowed to dominate. As technical reviews continued, focus shifted to cockpit environment. Not to assign blame, but to understand possibility. What information would have been available? What cues would have existed? What decisions could be made without external awareness? The cockpit is both insulated and isolated. Crews rely on internal instruments more than outside confirmation. If communication systems degrade, pilots are trained to continue flying, to troubleshoot, to follow procedures that prioritize control over explanation. This means a plane can remain stable while invisible. That thought sits uneasily with public expectations, but is not extraordinary in aviation terms. Loss of communication alone does not mandate emergency descent. It mandates patience, which introduces another unsettling idea. If communication was lost early, the crew may have believed the situation was manageable, temporary, solvable, not something worth alarming others about yet. Time passes differently in those moments. Minutes stretch as checklists are followed. Systems reset. Options considered. Each step logical. Each delay reasonable. From the outside, that looks like silence. From the inside, it may have felt like control. This possibility does not accuse. It humanizes. It reminds us that people act based on what they understand at the time, not on how events will later be interpreted. But again, without cockpit recordings, without data, without wreckage, this remains possibility, not conclusion. And possibility can be a burden. As days turned into weeks, the technical conversation narrowed rather than expanded. Not because answers were found, but because the limits of inference were reached. Beyond a certain point, speculation stopped being useful. Public interest, however, moved in the opposite direction. Silence from investigators created space, and space, once open, fills. Theories multiplied. Some grounded in technical detail, others shaped by mistrust of institutions, many driven by discomfort with unresolved endings. What was lost in that noise was how little investigators actually claimed to know. Behind closed doors, restraint remained. No definitive sequence, no official narrative, just acknowledgement of complexity. The aircraft's silence resisted simplification. It did not align neatly with failure. It did not confirm intention. It did not offer a clear moment where everything changed. Instead, it suggested a gradual narrowing of contact with the world, a transition from presence to absence that no single system was designed to explain. This is what makes the story endure. Not the shock, not the drama, but the way certainty slipped away quietly, leaving behind only fragments that refused to assemble into a single picture. As the investigation moved forward, attention would shift again, away from systems and toward people, away from machines and toward meaning. Because when technology reaches its limits, human interpretation takes over, and that is where stories become hardest to contain. By the time the search entered its next phase, the focus had moved outward again, not toward explanations, but toward geography. Once investigators accepted that the aircraft may have remained airborne far longer than first assumed, the ocean itself became the central problem, not as scenery, but as an obstacle to understanding. Oceans don't offer landmarks, they don't preserve easily, they don't return what they take in any predictable way. When something enters the water far from shore, time works against recovery almost immediately. Search planning had to confront scale in a way that felt almost abstract. Maps expanded until they stopped resembling places and began to resemble ideas. Vast areas marked not because anyone believed the aircraft was certainly there, but because it could not be ruled out. Probability replaced certainty. Search coordinators spoke in likelihoods, in ranges, in confidence bands that widened the farther they stretched from the last known point. Every mile added diluted focus, but removing areas felt equally dangerous. This is the paradox of searching without a fixed end. To narrow the field, investigators relied on models. Wind patterns, ocean currents, fuel consumption, aircraft performance under ideal and non-ideal conditions. Each variable added nuance, but also fragility. Small changes in assumption could move the search area hundreds of miles. Models are not guesses. They are disciplined estimates. But they depend on inputs that must be chosen, and those choices reflect belief as much as data. Search aircraft flew long, repetitive patterns over empty water. Crews looked down at surfaces that revealed nothing. No debris fields, no oil slicks, no signs that something massive had entered the ocean recently. This absence did not mean the aircraft was not there. It only meant the ocean was doing what it does best. Time passed. Underwater search planning followed a different logic. The seafloor is uneven, unpredictable. Mountains, trenches, ridges, places where objects can settle without being visible from above. Sonar can listen, but it listens slowly. It paints the bottom inch by inch, translating echoes into shapes that must then be interpreted by human eyes. This is patient work, exhausting work, and deeply uncertain. Each potential signal must be checked. Most turn out to be geological features, wrecks from older eras, shadows that vanish when viewed from another angle. Every false lead drains energy. Every missed possibility weighs heavily in hindsight. Search teams know this. They work anyway. Public attention followed these efforts closely at first. Ships, planes, technology, cooperation between nations. There was a sense that scale itself might overcome uncertainty. That if enough resources were applied, the ocean would eventually give something back. But oceans are not impressed by effort. As days turned into weeks, the emotional tone shifted. Initial urgency softened into endurance. Search operations became routine in their own way. Crews rotated. Reports repeated similar language. Progress slowed. Families waited. Waiting without information is not passive. It is active, draining, relentless. Every update, no matter how small, carries hope and fear in equal measure. Officials spoke carefully. They emphasized commitment. They acknowledged difficulty. They avoided timelines. Timelines are promises, and promises become accusations when they fail. Privately, planners confronted the reality that even with modern technology, large portions of the ocean remain poorly mapped. Searching them thoroughly could take years, not weeks, not months. This understanding changed the nature of expectation. The question shifted from, when will we find it, to how long can we keep looking. Resources are not infinite. Neither is attention. Search efforts must eventually justify themselves against probability, cost, and diminishing returns. This is a brutal calculation, even when handled with care. As search zones narrowed and widened again, the lack of physical evidence began to influence interpretation. Without debris, some theories weakened. Others grew stronger. Silence allows certain ideas to persist longer than they otherwise would. Yet investigators resisted allowing absence to dictate narrative. No debris does not mean no impact. No signal does not mean no event. No recovery does not mean no explanation exists. It simply means the environment is uncooperative. Over time, official updates became less frequent. Not because work stopped, but because there was less to say that was new. Repetition feels hollow when people are listening for change. Media attention shifted elsewhere. Other stories rose. This one settled into a quieter place, sustained mostly by those directly affected and those still trying to understand. Search operations continued in phases, paused, restarted, refined. Each time hope re-emerged briefly, then receded again. The ocean kept its silence. What remained was an uneasy balance between persistence and acceptance, between the belief that something must be found and the recognition that it might not be. This is where modern mystery becomes something else entirely, not a puzzle waiting to be solved, but a presence that lingers, a gap that resists closure. By the end of this phase, the search had done something important, even if it had not recovered the aircraft. It defines a limit of what could be known through effort alone. Beyond those limits, understanding, Session 3, would depend on interpretation, trust, and memory, and that is where stories stop belonging only to investigators. They begin to belong to everyone who cannot stop wondering. As active searching slowed, something quieter took its place. Reflection, not the kind that happens publicly, but the kind that happens when momentum fades and people are left with what they've already done. When maps have been marked and remarked, when equipment has been deployed and retrieved, when effort has reached the edge of usefulness. This is a difficult moment in any investigation. Stopping does not feel neutral. It feels like a decision, even when it is framed as a pause. For families, it can feel like abandonment. For investigators, it feels like restraint imposed by reality rather than choice. Officials were careful with their language. They spoke of suspension, not conclusion, of reassessment, not surrender. The door was left open deliberately, even as activity diminished. Behind those words was an acknowledgement that searching indefinitely is not the same as searching effectively. At some point, probability becomes too thin. The chance of discovery no longer justifies the strain on people, equipment, and coordination. This is not a moral judgment. It is an operational one. But it is still painful. For families, the slowing of the search changed the shape of grief. Hope did not disappear, but it became quieter, less urgent, less tied to daily updates. Waiting became more internal, more solitary. Some held on to the belief that something would surface eventually, a fragment, a signal, a confirmation. Others began the slow work of accepting that certainty might never arrive. There is no correct way to inhabit that space. Investigators continued working in other ways, reviewing data again, re-examining assumptions, revisiting early decisions with the benefit of distance. Sometimes distance clarifies, sometimes it only reveals how constrained choices were at the time. Criticism began to emerge more clearly once urgency faded. Questions about coordination, about timing, about transparency. These questions are inevitable. They arise whenever outcomes fall short of expectations. Some critiques were fair. Others assumed knowledge that had not existed in the moment. Hindsight sharpened edges that had been blurred by uncertainty. Investigators listened, but they also understood something the public often doesn't see. Investigations are not linear stories moving toward revelation. They are branching paths with dead ends, loops, and returns. Most work does not lead to answers. It leads to exclusions, to understanding what something is not. That kind of progress is hard to communicate. As months passed, the story settled into a quieter rhythm. Official briefings became rare. Technical discussions continued in smaller circles. Academic papers examined fragments of the data without claiming resolution. The mystery matured, not in the sense of being solved, but in the sense of becoming stable, no longer volatile. no longer changing shape daily. The outlines hardened, even if the center remained empty. This stability allowed other kinds of thinking to emerge. Questions about preparedness, about how modern systems handle ambiguity, about whether aviation, so focused on redundancy and precision, was equipped to respond to events that did not fail loudly. These questions mattered beyond this single flight. They spoke to trust, to how much faith people place in systems they never see. They also revealed discomfort. Modern life depends on the belief that disappearance is no longer possible at scale, that everything leaves a trace, that data accumulates, that nothing simply vanishes. This event challenged that belief, not by proving disappearance is common, but by demonstrating it is still possible. Even now, even with satellites, sensors, and global coordination, that realization lingered quietly. For some, it was unsettling. For others, it was strangely clarifying. It reminded people that systems are built by humans, and humans design within limits. No matter how advanced technology becomes, it cannot eliminate uncertainty entirely. It can only manage it. The absence of the aircraft became a symbol, not because it was unique, but because it resisted assimilation into existing explanations. It sat outside categories, not accident in the familiar sense, not crime with evidence, not failure with diagnostics, just absence. As time stretched on, new searches were proposed, some funded privately, some driven by renewed technological optimism. Each one carried hope, even if modest. When these efforts failed to recover anything conclusive, disappointment followed, but less sharply than before. Expectations had adjusted, hope had learned restraint. What remained was a shared understanding that this story would likely never close neatly, that any future discovery, if it came, would answer some questions and raise others. Closure had become unlikely. Meaning, however, was still possible. Meaning could be found in how systems responded, in how families endured, in how the world grappled with not knowing. This is not the kind of meaning people ask for. It does not soothe easily. But it is real. By this point in the story, the aircraft was no longer only an object of search, it was a reference point, a reminder that uncertainty still exists in places we thought were mapped. The ocean had not given answers, but it had forced humility. And humility, though uncomfortable, can be instructive. As attention began to shift away from logistics and toward interpretation, the story entered a new phase, one less about machines and more about people, about belief, about doubt, about how narratives form when facts remain incomplete. That is where this mystery would continue to live, not in wreckage, not in coordinates, but in the space between what is known and what is assumed. As physical searching receded, attention returned to what little had been found, small pieces, fragments without context. They arrive quietly, often years apart, carried by currents rather than intention. A panel, a surface, something recognizable enough to belong to an aircraft, but not enough to explain how it had come to rest where it did. Each fragment mattered, not because it solved anything, but because it proved the story had not dissolved completely into theory. Something tangible still existed, something that had once been part of a whole. Investigators approached these discoveries carefully. Confirmation came first. Serial numbers, manufacturing details, wear patterns. Each piece was examined not just for what it was, but for what it could not say. Debris does not narrate events. It offers clues without sequence. It suggests contact with water, with time, with force, but rarely specifies order. What mattered most was location. Where fragments were found did not align neatly with early expectations. Currents can carry objects vast distances, but only within certain constraints. Each discovery forced models to be revisited, adjusted, sometimes contradicted. This created a strange tension. On one hand, debris supported the idea that the aircraft had entered the ocean. On the other, it resisted being placed cleanly within existing timelines and paths. It confirmed loss without clarifying process. Some pieces showed signs of separation consistent with high-energy events, others did not. None could be tied conclusively to a specific moment. This inconsistency frustrated easy explanation. People often assume wreckage tells a clear story. In reality, it rarely does, especially when only fragments are recovered, especially when the environment has had years to alter them. Salt water erases detail, sunlight weakens material, Time softens edges that once told sharper truths. Investigators resisted over-interpretation. A single piece cannot represent an entire event. Patterns require context, and context was still missing. Still, the presence of debris changed the emotional temperature of the story. It shifted the conversation from disappearance to loss, from uncertainty about existence to uncertainty about sequence. For families, this was complicated. Confirmation of debris brought validation, but also finality without clarity. Proof that the aircraft was gone without explanation of how or why. Grief with unresolved questions tends to linger differently. Hope did not vanish entirely. Some held on to the possibility that more would be found. That wreckage might eventually reveal a clearer narrative. Others found that each fragment reopened pain rather than easing it. There is no correct response to partial answers. Public discussion intensified briefly with each discovery. Media attention flared. Speculation followed. But without new context, interest faded again. Fragments alone could not sustain a narrative. Behind the scenes, technical analysis continued. Experts debated what could be inferred from damage patterns, how components behave under different stresses, whether absence of certain marks ruled out specific scenarios. These discussions were careful, often inconclusive. A missing wing section does not tell you how the plane descended. A damaged panel does not reveal intent. Wreckage can eliminate some possibilities, but rarely confirms one alone. This is why investigators avoid dramatic conclusions drawn from isolated evidence. Debris can say this happened, but not this is how. As more time passed without additional recovery, the fragments took on symbolic weight. They became stand-ins for the whole, proof of reality in a story dominated by abstraction. But symbols are dangerous. They invite meaning beyond evidence. Investigators guarded against this. They returned repeatedly to what could be stated with confidence and nothing more. The aircraft had entered the ocean. Some components had separated. The exact sequence remained unknown. This restraint frustrated those seeking certainty, but it preserved integrity. The debris did not contradict earlier satellite data. It did not confirm it either. It simply coexisted with it, offering physical confirmation without explanatory power. In that sense, the fragments mirrored the larger mystery. Present, but incomplete. Over time, interest in debris waned. The discoveries became footnotes rather than headlines. Without a breakthrough, attention moved elsewhere. But the fragments remained stored, catalogued, preserved, waiting, in case future understanding might give them new meaning. This is how investigations endure. Not as constant activity, but as readiness. An openness to re-examination if new information emerges. For now, the pieces rested quietly, bearing witness without testimony. They confirmed what had already become emotionally accepted, even if intellectually unresolved. The aircraft did not vanish into nothing. It left traces, but those traces refused to arrange themselves into a story with an ending. As this phase settled, the focus shifted again. Away from material evidence, away from systems and searches, toward people, toward interpretation, toward belief, toward the ways humans try to make sense of uncertainty when facts no longer advance. That is where this mystery would continue to live. Not in metal or water, but in minds. As physical evidence settled into storage and analysis slowed, attention drifted toward something less tangible. Narrative. When facts stop accumulating, stories begin to carry more weight. Not because they are true, but because they offer structure. They give shape to uncertainty. And in the absence of new data, the human mind reaches for shape almost automatically. Investigators are trained to resist this impulse. Families are not. For those closest to the loss, the question was no longer only what happened, but how to live with not knowing. Debra confirmed reality without providing understanding. That kind of confirmation can feel hollow. It closes one door while leaving every other door open. Some families focused on the fragments themselves, on what each piece might still reveal. Others avoided them entirely. Looking felt too much like reopening a wound without the promise of relief. Grief adapts in strange ways when certainty never arrives. In public spaces, interpretation filled the gap. Analysts revisited old assumptions. Commentators connected dots that had never been meant to touch. Each new retelling emphasized different elements, depending on what the teller found most unsettling. For some, it was the idea of prolonged flight. For others, the absence of distress. For others still, the possibility of deliberate action. None of these narratives could be proven. None could be fully dismissed either. This ambiguity allowed belief to take root. Belief is not always irrational. It often grows where information stops. When official explanations are incomplete by necessity, people look elsewhere for coherence, not out of defiance but out of discomfort with unresolved space. Investigators understood this, even as they avoided engaging with it. Their role was not to comfort through storytelling, but to preserve accuracy through restraint. That restraint, however, can feel cold. As years passed, the mystery became less about aviation and more about trust. Trust in systems. Trust in institutions. Trust that important events will eventually make sense. This flight challenged that trust quietly, not by revealing corruption or failure outright, but by demonstrating that even well-functioning systems can be overtaken by uncertainty. Some events resist closure not because of deception, but because complexity outpaces explanation. This distinction is subtle, and it is often lost. Without new evidence, every theory began to sound familiar. Patterns repeated. Arguments looped. The story stabilized into a set of known unknowns. And yet, it refused to fade. The fragments had done something important, even without answering questions. They grounded the story in reality. They prevented it from drifting entirely into abstraction. They reminded everyone that this was not a thought experiment, but a human loss. At the same time, they marked a boundary. Beyond these pieces, knowledge did not advance. That boundary forced a reckoning. For investigators, it meant acknowledging limits. For families, it meant redefining hope. For the public, it meant deciding how much uncertainty could be tolerated without resolution. Some found peace in acceptance, others did not. Both responses are human. Over time, anniversaries replaced updates. Dates returned each year, marked by quiet remembrance rather than expectation. Statements became shorter, language more reflective than urgent. The story aged. It became something people remembered rather than followed, something referenced rather than anticipated. And yet, it never fully receded into the past. Because unanswered questions do not age the way answered ones do, they remain present, waiting. In academic circles, the case continued to appear as a reference point, not as a solved example, but as a cautionary one, a reminder of how modern systems can still lose track of complexity, how redundancy does not guarantee transparency. These discussions were sober, practical, less interested in blame than in resilience. What could be learned? What could be improved? What could be improved? What could be accepted as irreducible uncertainty? But learning does not erase loss. The fragments remained where they were, catalogued and silent. They would not speak unless new context gave them a voice. Until then, they existed as evidence without explanation. This is an uncomfortable state for any investigation, but it is sometimes the most honest one. By the end of this phase, the mystery had changed form. It was no longer a search, no longer an active investigation in the usual sense. It was a question carried forward. A question that lived in different places for different people, in technical journals, in family memories, in late-night conversations, in quiet moments when certainty feels fragile. The aircraft had left the world physically, but the uncertainty it created had not, and perhaps that is the most difficult outcome of all. Not that answers were lost, but that they may never have existed in a form that could be fully recovered. As the story moved on, it would move into its most unstable territory, the space where explanation gives way to belief, where official silence meets human imagination, where meaning is constructed rather than discovered. That is where the mystery deepens, even without new facts. As time passed and official movement slowed, attention drifted toward the people connected to the flight. Not just the passengers and crew, but those who remained behind, trying to understand the loss that offered no clear shape. Human stories do not pause when investigations do. Families returned to ordinary life carrying an unresolved absence. Work resumed. Children grew older. Seasons changed, but something stayed suspended. Without a final account, memory never settled. It kept revisiting the same unanswered moment, turning it slightly each time, hoping it might look different. For some, daily routines became anchors. Familiar tasks provided structure when certainty could not. For others, routine felt hollow. How do you return to normal when the story that disrupted it never ended? Grief usually follows a path. Not a stray one, but a path nonetheless. It moves through shock, pain, adjustment, and eventually, some form of integration. When loss has no explanation, that path fragments. Each stage reappears unexpectedly, triggered by small reminders. An empty chair, a postponed message, a piece of news that sounds almost relevant. The absence of clarity affects how memory forms. Without a final moment to frame the story, memories stay open-ended. The past feels unfinished. Some families sought answers actively. They read reports, attended briefings, learned technical language they never expected to know. Understanding became a way to stay connected, to feel involved rather than helpless. Others chose distance, not because they cared less, but because constant exposure to uncertainty felt unbearable. Protecting oneself sometimes means stepping away from questions that refuse to resolve. Neither approach is wrong. Public narratives often struggle with this complexity. Stories prefer resolution, heroes, villains, lessons learned. This story offered none of those cleanly. As years passed, attention shifted toward individuals connected to the flight. Especially the crew, pilots in particular, became focal points of speculation. Not because evidence demanded it, but because human minds search for agency when faced with ambiguity. Agency offers explanation, but speculation carries weight, especially when directed toward people who can no longer respond. Investigators were careful here. They avoided conclusions about intent. They spoke cautiously about possibilities without endorsing narratives that could not be supported. This restraint protected integrity, but it did not stop speculation elsewhere. In the absence of definitive answers, suspicion can attach itself to fragments of information, past behavior, psychological profiles, professional histories, details that in isolation mean little, but under uncertainty begin to feel significant. This is one of the quiet harms of unresolved events. People become symbols rather than individuals, their complexity flattened into narratives that serve explanation rather than truth. Families of crew members carried this burden silently, not only grieving loss but navigating suspicion without evidence. This is a secondary loss, rarely acknowledged. As time stretched on, public interest ebbed and flowed. Documentaries revisited the story. Articles resurfaced. Each retelling emphasized different aspects depending on the storyteller's focus. Some leaned toward technical mystery, some toward institutional failure, some toward human intention. Each version felt incomplete in its own way. What remained consistent was the tone of uncertainty. No retelling could escape it. For many listeners, the story became a late-night thought, something that surfaced during quiet moments, a reminder that even tightly controlled systems can lose track of something precious. That reminder carried emotional weight beyond this single event. It touched on broader anxieties about trust, control, and vulnerability. Modern life promises traceability. Records, logs, data trails. The idea that everything important leaves evidence. This story challenged that promise. It suggested that some events slip through even dense networks of observation. That certainty is conditional, not absolute. For families, this broader meaning offered little comfort. Meaning does not replace answers. It does not substitute for explanation. What it can offer sometimes is companionship. The sense that others are still thinking, still remembering, still holding space for the unresolved. Over time, some families found ways to integrate uncertainty into their lives. Not by accepting it fully, but by acknowledging its permanence, by allowing unanswered questions to exist without demanding daily resolution. This is not closure, it is adaptation. Others continue to search, to advocate, to press for renewed investigation. Their persistence kept the story alive. It ensured the absence was not forgotten or normalized. Both responses shaped the legacy of the event. The story did not fade into obscurity because it was dramatic. It endured because it remained incomplete, because it resisted assimilation into neat categories. Human beings are uncomfortable with that kind of openness, but they are also capable of carrying it given time. As the years passed, the flight became a reference point, not just in aviation, but in conversations about uncertainty itself, about how societies respond when systems fail quietly rather than catastrophically. This was not a story of explosion or spectacle. It was a story of gradual disappearance, of silence expanding rather than arriving all at once. And silence invites reflection. It asks different questions than noise does. It lingers. It waits. For those directly affected, the waiting never fully ended. It changed form, but it did not disappear. For the rest of the world, the story settled into memory, surfacing occasionally, often late at night, when certainty feels less solid. That is where this mystery continues to live. Not in data alone, not in debris, but in the quiet space where human meaning tries to form around something that never explained itself. As attention shifted further from investigation to interpretation, the story entered a quieter, more fragile phase. This was no longer about evidence or analysis. It was about how people made sense of what remained. When facts stop advancing, belief doesn't rush in all at once. It arrives slowly, shaped by temperament, experience, and trust. Some people leaned toward official restraint, accepting that uncertainty was the most honest outcome available. Others found that explanation, even imperfect, felt better than silence. This divergence was not ideological. It was emotional. Belief is often less about truth than about tolerance. How much ambiguity a person can carry without needing to resolve it. As the years went on, certain interpretations gained familiarity, not because they were proven, but because repetition gave them weight. Familiar stories feel stable, even when they rest on speculation. These narratives were shared quietly at first, in forums, in long-form discussions, in late-night conversations where curiosity replaced urgency. Over time, they hardened into positions, not conclusions, but preferences. Investigators watched this development from a distance. They rarely intervened, not because they agreed, but because disputing speculation without new evidence can make it stronger rather than weaker. Silence, in this context, was a form of discipline. The risk, however, was that silence could be misread as withholding, as absence of transparency rather than absence of certainty. This tension eroded trust for some, even when restraint was justified. Trust is delicate when outcomes are incomplete. Institutions depend on credibility, but credibility depends on closure. When closure never arrives, credibility becomes vulnerable to interpretation. This flight became a symbol for that vulnerability, not as proof of deception, but as evidence that systems are limited in ways people find unsettling. That global coordination does not guarantee resolution, that technology does not eliminate mystery. These realizations collided with cultural expectations. Modern life teaches us that everything important is traceable, that data accumulates until understanding becomes inevitable. This story contradicted that lesson quietly. It suggested that complexity can exceed observation, that even dense networks of sensors and protocols can miss something essential. For some, this realization deepened anxiety. For others, it prompted humility. Humility is uncomfortable in systems designed around confidence. Over time, the story took on a reflective quality. It was no longer about what happened, but about what the absence revealed, about the limits of certainty, about the human need for explanation even when explanation may not be possible. Late at night, when the world feels quieter and thoughts slow down, this kind of story has a way of resurfacing, not because it is frightening, but because it remains open. Open stories invite contemplation rather than reaction. They allow doubt to coexist with curiosity. They do not demand resolution. This is why the mystery endured without escalation. It did not provoke panic. It provoked reflection. People did not return to it for answers. They returned to it to sit with the question. What does it mean when something disappears without explanation in a world built on tracking and accountability? What does it say about our relationship with technology, trust, and control? These questions did not belong to investigators alone. They belonged to anyone willing to think quietly about uncertainty. For families, this broader meaning did not replace personal loss, but for some, it offered a way to place that loss within a larger human story. Not as an anomaly, but as part of a shared struggle with not knowing. Others rejected that framing entirely. Meaning does not soften grief equally. Sometimes it feels like distance. Both responses are human. As the story aged, it lost urgency but gained depth. It became less about answers and more about endurance, about how long uncertainty can be carried without becoming corrosive. The flight was no longer missing in the same way. It had become a fixed absence, a known unknown. That is a strange category. It does not demand daily attention, but it never fully leaves. It surfaces during anniversaries, during news of other disappearances, during quiet moments when control feels less assured. And each time it surfaces, it asks the same unanswerable question. Not what happened, but how do we live with not knowing? This is not a question aviation systems are designed to answer. It is a human one. As the narrative continued, it moved toward its final terrain, not toward resolution, but toward reflection. Toward what remains after facts, theories, and searches have reached their limits. The story did not end. It settled. And in that settling, it became something people carried rather than solved. By the time the story reached this stage, it had loosened its grip on chronology. Dates mattered less. Sequences blurred. What remained was a feeling rather than a timeline. A sense that something important had slipped past understanding and left a shape behind it. This is often where alternative explanations begin to appear. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but gradually, as people return to the same unanswered points and find that official language no longer satisfies the questions they're asking. These explanations did not emerge in a vacuum. They were built from real gaps, from inconsistencies that never fully closed, from decisions that made sense operationally but felt incomplete emotionally. When uncertainty persists, people don't invent explanations out of nothing. They rearrange what already exists. Some focused on the flight path, the idea that the aircraft may have moved deliberately rather than drifted. This interpretation did not require fantasy. It required intention, which felt more manageable than randomness. Intention suggests agency. Agency suggests reason. Others focused on institutional response, on why information arrived when it did, on why some data was emphasized and other data minimized. These questions were less about conspiracy and more about trust. Trust erodes quietly when communication is cautious but prolonged. It's important to understand that most of these interpretations were not extreme. They did not claim hidden technologies or secret plots. They asked simpler, more uncomfortable questions. Could something have been known but not shared immediately? Could uncertainty have been smoothed over to maintain calm? Could decisions have been influenced by factors never fully explained publicly? These questions did not accuse, they lingered. In complex international events, communication is layered. Governments coordinate. Agencies consult. Statements are negotiated. What emerges publicly is often the most careful version of the truth, not the most complete. This is not deception. It is risk management, but risk management can feel like withholding when people are desperate for clarity. As time passed, some explanations gained traction not because they were proven, but because they addressed emotional needs left unmet by official restraint. They offered coherence where facts had stalled. This is how belief systems form around unresolved events. They are not born from imagination alone. They grow from discomfort with silence. Investigators understood this dynamic even as they avoided engaging with it directly. They knew that disproving an unprovable claim is impossible. Without new evidence, argument only amplifies attention, so they remained quiet. That quiet again was interpreted in multiple ways. For some, it reinforced trust, a sign of professionalism, a refusal to speculate beyond evidence. For others, it felt like distance, like a story being managed rather than shared. Both interpretations existed simultaneously. What made this case especially fertile ground for alternative explanations was its lack of contradiction. There was no wreckage field that forced one narrative, no final transmission that anchored the story emotionally. Everything was inferred. Inference is flexible. Inference invites rearrangement. People began to return to earlier moments, re-examining them with different emphasis. A phrase in a transcript, a delay in reporting, a change in tone between statements. These details had always been there. What changed was the lens through which they were viewed. The longer uncertainty lasted, the more meaning people tried to extract from small things. This is not irrational, it is human. When large answers are unavailable, attention moves to small details. They feel manageable. They offer the illusion of progress. Some narratives focused on human decision-making inside the cockpit, not as accusation, but as possibility. What might someone do if faced with a situation no checklist addressed? How much autonomy exists in moments when systems fall silent? Others focused outward, on coordination between nations, on jurisdictional boundaries, on how shared responsibility can sometimes dilute accountability. These narratives did not require secret knowledge. They required only the acknowledgement that complex systems do not always speak with one voice. As these ideas circulated, They influenced how the story was remembered, not as a single mystery, but as a collection of unresolved threads. Each listener gravitated toward the thread that resonated with their own concerns. Those uneasy with randomness leaned toward intention. Those uneasy with institutions leaned toward opacity. Those uneasy with uncertainty leaned toward explanation of any kind. What united these responses was not belief in a specific answer, but discomfort with emptiness. Official accounts remained careful throughout. They did not deny alternative explanations outright. They simply did not endorse them. This stance frustrated some, reassured others, and left most people somewhere in between. Over time, the presence of multiple interpretations became part of the story itself. The mystery was no longer just about flight. It was about how societies process unresolved loss, about how silence can mean different things to different people, about how explanation and comfort are not always aligned. By this stage, the event had moved fully into the realm of reflection. It no longer demanded resolution. It invited contemplation, not of what happened, but of what happens when answers do not arrive. This is where the story becomes less about aviation and more about psychology, less about systems and more about meaning, and that transition is subtle. It doesn't announce itself. It happens quietly, late at night, when the mind wanders back to unanswered questions and finds they still haven't changed. The mystery endures, not because it is dramatic, but because it remains open. And open questions have a way of staying with us longer than closed ones ever do. As alternative explanations settled into familiarity, something else began to change. The tone. Early discussions had been tense, urgent, driven by the hope that the right question might unlock a final answer. Now the conversation slowed. They became quieter, more reflective, less about solving and more about understanding why solving mattered so much. People began to notice patterns in themselves, how certain ideas felt comforting, even without proof, how others felt disturbing, even when plausible, how belief often followed emotion rather than evidence. This realization didn't end speculation, it softened it. When an event remains unresolved long enough, it stops feeling like a problem to fix and starts feeling like a presence to live alongside. The mystery becomes familiar. Its sharp edges wear down, not because answers arrive, but because the mind adapts. This adaptation is subtle. People still ask what happened, but the question carries less urgency. It becomes philosophical rather than investigative, a way to reflect on uncertainty itself. In this case, many of the alternative explanations shared a common thread. They weren't really about the aircraft, they were about control, about whether the world behaves according to rules we understand, about whether systems protect us as completely as we believe, about whether silence means nothing or something withheld. These concerns extend far beyond aviation. They touch everyday life, technology, governance, trust, the quiet anxiety that comes from realizing how much of modern life depends on invisible processes we rarely question. This is why the story endured in quiet spaces rather than loud ones. It resurfaced not during breaking news, but during late-night listening, in documentaries watched alone, in conversations that drifted into uncertainty rather than debate. The absence of spectacle made it contemplative rather than sensational. Some people eventually grew tired of speculation. They stepped away, choosing to accept that no satisfying explanation might ever come. This acceptance wasn't defeat, it was a boundary, a decision to stop feeding anxiety with questions that led nowhere. Others continued to engage, but with less intensity. The search for answers became more about community than conclusion, about sharing thoughts, comparing perspectives, acknowledging doubt. This is how unresolved events change function. They stop demanding answers and start facilitating dialogue. In official circles, the case remained open in principle, even if inactive in practice. Files stayed accessible, data preserved, the possibility of new information acknowledged without expectation. This stance mattered symbolically. It signaled that uncertainty had not been dismissed or forgotten, even if action had paused. For families, this symbolic openness carried different meanings. For some, it was reassurance. For others, it felt insufficient. A reminder that acknowledgement is not the same as resolution. Time does not heal uncertainty in the same way it heals other wounds. It changes the relationship to it. Sharp pain becomes dull ache. Ash becomes background presence. The story aged alongside those connected to it. Children grew up knowing a name without a story. Spouses learned to speak of loss without explanation. Friends adjusted to the idea that some questions would never be answered. These adaptations rarely make headlines. They happen quietly, privately, without commentary. Public memory followed a similar path. The flight became a reference rather than an event, mentioned in passing, used as example, invoked when discussing disappearance, ambiguity, or the limits of technology. It was no longer shocking. It was instructive. This shift stripped the story of urgency but gave it depth. Depth allows space for humility, for acknowledging that not everything fits into narrative arcs with clear beginnings and ends. The alternative explanations that remained were no longer competing for dominance. They coexisted. Each offered a lens rather than a claim, a way of thinking rather than a conclusion. Some people moved between them fluidly, others settled into one that felt most tolerable. Tolerance became the measure, not truth. This is uncomfortable to admit, but honest. When facts remain incomplete, emotional survivability often guides belief more than evidence does. People choose interpretations that allow them to sleep at night, that reduce cognitive dissonance, that align with their broader worldview. This does not make them irrational, it makes them human. In this sense, the mystery served as a mirror. It reflected how different people respond to uncertainty. Who seeks structure? Who tolerates ambiguity? Who needs explanation? And who can sit with absence? The aircraft itself receded further into abstraction. Metal and systems mattered less than what they symbolized. Loss without explanation. Silence without closure. A question without an answer. These themes are not unique to this event. They appear throughout history. What made this case distinctive was how modern it was. How thoroughly observed the world was supposed to be. How complete trekking was assumed to be. The gap between expectation and outcome created discomfort that never fully resolved. As this chapter of the story settled, it became clear that no future discovery, if it came, would erase what had already formed around the mystery. Even answers would have to contend with years of interpretation layered on top of absence. Sometimes answers arrive too late to simplify. They close one question but leave many others intact. For now, the story remained what it had become. Not an investigation, not a search, but a quiet companion to thought. Something people returned to when certainty elsewhere felt fragile. Something that reminded them that knowing has limits, even in a world designed to track everything. As the narrative moved toward its final chapters, it would do so without expectation of resolution. Only reflection remained. Reflection on how we respond when systems go silent, on how meaning forms in the absence of facts, on how unanswered questions shape memory more deeply than answered ones ever do. As the story entered its later years, something subtle but important began to shift again. Attention moved away from the aircraft and toward the structures around it. Not in search of blame, but in search of understanding how information travels when responsibility is shared, when no single authority owns the whole picture, when truth is distributed across borders, agencies and systems that do not always speak the same language. This flight crossed more than physical space. It crossed jurisdictions. Each handoff of responsibility made sense on its own. Each followed established protocols, but together they created a situation where knowledge was fragmented. No one entity saw everything at once. No one voice could speak with complete authority. This is not unusual in international aviation. It is simply rarely tested this severely. In the early stages, coordination was driven by urgency. Information was exchanged quickly, sometimes imperfectly. As time passed and urgency faded, coordination slowed. Data became static. Interpretations diverged. Public statements reflected this complexity. They were careful, qualified, often framed in probabilities rather than assertions. This language was accurate, but it carried emotional consequences. Probability does not comfort easily. It feels evasive to those searching for certainty. Governments are cautious not only because they fear being wrong, but because being definitive carries consequences. Diplomatic, legal, and ethical consequences. Once an explanation is declared, it reshapes accountability. In this case, no explanation could be declared without leaving gaps. That restraint, while responsible, created a vacuum. And vacuums invite interpretation. Some people began to question whether information had been delayed or softened to manage public response. Not necessarily to deceive, but to maintain calm, to prevent panic, to protect confidence in systems that most people rely on daily. This idea did not require conspiracy. It required only an understanding of institutional behavior under uncertainty. Institutions are designed to project stability. Uncertainty undermines that projection. From this perspective, caution can look like opacity, even when it isn't. As years passed, official narratives became more settled, not more certain, but more bounded. Certain explanations were emphasized, others quietly receded, not erased, but deprioritized. This is how institutional memory works. Over time, complexity is reduced not through resolution, but through focus. Stories that are easier to communicate endure. Those that resist simplification fade. This process is not malicious, it is practical. But it can feel unsatisfying to those who remember how many questions were once open. Some observers began to feel that the story had been gently narrowed, that possibilities once acknowledged were no longer discussed openly. Again, not necessarily because they were disproven, but because they complicated communication. Complication is costly. It invites follow-up questions. It prolongs uncertainty. It keeps stories alive longer than institutions often prefer. At the same time, new generations encountered the story differently. Without the emotional immediacy of the early days, they approached it analytically, as a case study, as a reference, as an example of systemic limits. Distance changes perspective. For them, the lack of resolution was not a shock. It was a feature, something to be examined rather than resisted. This generational shift softened some tensions while creating others. What felt like abandonment to those closest to the loss could feel like closure to those arriving later. Closure by normalization rather than explanation. That distinction matters. In policy discussions, the case influence changes quietly. Improvements in tracking, better coordination, new standards for data retention and sharing. These changes were rarely framed as responses to failure, but as evolution. Systems learn slowly. They adapt not by admitting weakness, but by incorporating lessons discreetly. The absence of a final explanation did not prevent progress. It redirected it. This too complicated public perception. If systems improved, some wondered why answers remained elusive. If answers remained elusive, others questioned whether improvements mattered. These are not contradictions. They are parallel truths. The story sat uncomfortably between them. As institutional attention faded, symbolic gestures took its place. Memorials, anniversaries, statements that acknowledged loss without revisiting uncertainty. Symbols are a way of honoring without explaining. They offer recognition without resolution. For some, this was enough. A way to mark absence without reopening wounds. For others, it felt like an ending imposed without consent. Grief does not align neatly with institutional timelines. This misalignment fueled quiet frustration. Not anger, but a sense that the story had been set aside before it had been understood. Over time, this frustration softened into resignation for many, not because answers arrived, but because energy waned. Sustaining uncertainty requires effort. Eventually, people must choose how much space it occupies in their lives. Institutions made that choice by moving forward. Individuals made it in different ways. Some continued to speak, to write, to remember actively. Others carried the story privately, letting it surface only occasionally. Neither approach erased the past. They simply shaped how it lived in the present. By this stage, the mystery had become less volatile, but no less unresolved. It had settled into the background of collective awareness. Not forgotten, but no longer demanding. This is a strange fate for a question once so urgent. But it is not uncommon. History is filled with moments that never fully explain themselves. They persist not as open investigations, but as reminders of limits, of the places where certainty stops. This fight joined that category, not because it lacked importance, but because importance alone does not guarantee understanding. As the narrative approached its final chapter, what remained was not a search for answers, but a reflection on process, on how institutions manage uncertainty, on how people respond when explanations stall, and on how silence, when sustained long enough, becomes part of the story rather than its absence. As institutional narratives settled and public attention thinned, the story entered a quieter afterlife. This was the phase where nothing new happened, yet nothing truly ended. Officially, the case remained open. Unofficially, it became dormant. Files rested, data stayed archived. Statements were rarely updated, not because interest was gone, but because movement had stopped. There is a difference. Dormancy is not closure. It is a pause without an expected end. The institutions, this state is familiar. Many unresolved cases live this way, suspended between relevance and history. They are acknowledged but not pursued, remembered but not advanced. For individuals, dormancy feels different. It can feel like abandonment or like mercy, depending on how uncertainty has shaped them. Some families continue to press quietly. Letters, requests, occasional interviews. Not driven by expectation anymore, but by presence. A way of saying, this still matters. Others stepped back, not because they believed answers were impossible, but because waiting indefinitely had become its own kind of harm. Choosing distance was a way to survive, not to forget. Public discourse shifted again during this time. Without new developments, the story lost its sharp edges. It became something people referenced rather than followed, a shorthand for disappearance, a reminder that even modern systems can fail silently. This transformation stripped the story of urgency, but gave it a strange permanence. It no longer demanded attention, but it did not disappear either. In policy circles, the case was cited carefully, not as an embarrassment, but as a boundary, a point where confidence met reality. Improvements were framed as progress rather than correction. This framing mattered. Admitting failure undermines trust. Demonstrating adaptation preserves it. Institutions tend to choose the latter, even when both are true. For observers, this created tension. Progress without explanation can feel hollow. Change without acknowledgement can feel evasive. But institutions operate on continuity. They move forward because stopping is not an option. This divergence between institutional momentum and personal grief remained unresolved. As years passed, the story's emotional weight redistributed. It became lighter for those distant from it, heavier for those who carried it closely. This imbalance is inevitable. Collected memory fades faster than personal memory ever can. The absence of a final narrative left room for reinterpretation over time. New contexts reframed old questions. Advances in technology sparked renewed hope briefly, then receded again. Each cycle followed the same pattern. Expectation, speculation, disappointment, silence. With each repetition, intensity diminished, not because the mystery mattered less, but because emotional energy is finite. Eventually, the story found a stable form. It became an unresolved reference point rather than an active wound. Mentioned without urgency, remembered without expectation. This is not the ending people hope for, but it is often the ending that arrives. What remained was a quiet understanding that some events resist explanation, not because of secrecy or neglect, but because complexity, scale, and circumstance align in ways that overwhelm even the best systems. This understanding does not absolve responsibility. It contextualizes limitation, and limitation is uncomfortable in a world that promises mastery. As the story approached its final reflection, the question was no longer about finding answers. It was about what? Section 5. Unanswered questions due to us. How they shape trust, how they influence belief, how they linger long after attention moves on. This flight did not change aviation overnight. It did not dismantle institutions. It did not rewrite history. What it did was quieter. It reminded people that certainty is conditional, that systems are powerful but not absolute, that absence can persist even in an age defined by data. These reminders do not demand reaction. They invite humility. And humility rarely announces itself loudly. It settles in slowly. Late at night, in moments of quiet reflection. By now, the mystery had become less about the aircraft and more about what the absence revealed about us. About how we respond to silence. About how much explanation we need to feel at peace. About how we carry questions that may never be answered. The story had not ended. It had transformed. And transformation, unlike resolution, does not close a door. It leaves it slightly open. As the story reached its far edge, it did not arrive at a conclusion. It arrived at stillness. By this point, the aircraft itself had almost disappeared from focus. Not forgotten, but abstracted. Reduced to a symbol more than an object. Metal and systems mattered less than what their absence had stirred over time. What lingered was the question people carry quietly, often without realizing it. Not what happened, but what it means when we don't know. In a world built on prediction and monitoring, this event sat like a soft contradiction. It didn't challenge technology loudly. It didn't collapse trust all at once. It simply slipped through, leaving behind a gap that never quite closed, and gaps change how people think. Some learn to live more comfortably with uncertainty, to accept that not every story resolves, and that resolution is not a requirement for remembrance. Others found the opposite. The unanswered questions sharpened anxiety, made the world feel less reliable, less contained. Both responses were reasonable. What mattered was not which one people chose, but that they had to choose at all. Over time, the mystery stopped asking to be solved and started asking to be held gently, without forcing meaning onto it, without demanding it behave like a lesson. Late at night, when distractions fall away, this is the version of the story that returns. Not the timelines, not the theories, not the data points, just the sense of something unresolved resting quietly beneath the surface of thought. It's there when rain taps against windows, when familiar sounds fade, when the mind wanders without direction. The absence becomes almost companionable, not comforting, but familiar. This is not how stories are supposed to end, but it is how some of them do. They don't conclude. They recede. They move from the front of the mind to the background, from urgency to presence, from problem to reminder. The reminder here is subtle. That control is never complete. That systems, no matter how advanced, still depend on assumptions. That silence does not always mean nothing happened. And perhaps most importantly, that not knowing does not invalidate care. People still remember. People still wonder. People still pause occasionally and think about those who never arrived. The mystery does not demand attention anymore. It waits patiently. It surfaces when the world feels quiet enough to notice it again. That patience is what makes it enduring. If answers ever come, they will arrive into a world that has already learned to live without them. They will clarify some things and complicate others. They will not undo the years of uncertainty that shaped memory and belief, and that is okay, because meaning does not require certainty. It requires acknowledgement. Acknowledgement that something was lost. Acknowledgement that questions remain. Acknowledgement that silence can be heavy without being hostile. This story, in the end, is not about disappearance. It is about endurance, of memory, of doubt, of the human capacity to carry unanswered questions without breaking. The aircraft left the sky. The mystery stayed behind. And it stayed quietly, without urgency, without demand, just there. There isn't much left to add now. That too is part of the story. When everything that can be said has already been said, what remains is not explanation, but presence. The way certain questions stay nearby, not demanding answers, only recognition. This is where the mystery finally rests. Not resolved, not solved, but placed somewhere quieter. Over the years, the absence has learned how to exist without urgency. It no longer interrupts daily life. It doesn't insist on attention. Instead, it appears softly when conditions are right. During moments of stillness, during long pauses, during nights when the world feels slightly unfinished. For many people, the story has become less about the flight and more about the feeling it left behind. A reminder that certainty is something we borrow, not something we own. We live as if systems are complete, as if coverage is total, as if every important event leaves a trail that can be followed back to understanding. Most of the time, that belief works well enough to let life continue smoothly, and then something slips through, not violently, not dramatically, just quietly, and the quiet changes us. It changes how we listen, how we trust, how we sit with questions that don't move forward. This mystery didn't teach a lesson in the way stories usually do. It didn't warn, it didn't moralize, it didn't conclude. It simply demonstrated a boundary, a place where knowledge stopped not because of indifference or malice, but because the world is larger and more complex than our systems can fully contain. That boundary is uncomfortable, but it is honest. For families, the absence remains personal. It doesn't soften into abstraction. It stays tied to names, voices, habits, and memories that never reach their next chapter. No amount of reflection transforms that loss into something easier. What reflection can do is offer companionship, the sense that the world has not forgotten, that the silence is shared, even if it cannot be filled. For everyone else, the story has become something quieter and more internal. A thought that surfaces occasionally, a question that lingers without pressure, a reminder that not everything ends with explanation. And perhaps that is why this story works so well in the dark. In the dark, the mind does not rush, it does not demand resolution. It allows uncertainty to exist without resistance. The absence becomes less threatening there, less sharp, more like a still space than a wound. That doesn't make it harmless, it makes it manageable. If answers ever arrive, they will arrive into this stillness. They will be received not with shock, but with a careful kind of attention. They will matter, but they will not undo the years spent living without them. Because the living already happened. Life continued. Memory adapted. Silence found a place. The story didn't end because endings require certainty. Instead, it faded into something else. A quiet marker in human experience. A reminder of limits. A soft echo of a night when routine gave way to absence. And that echo remains. Not loud, not insistent. Just present, like rain in the distance. Like a thought you don't follow all the way through. Like a question you've learned how to carry. Nothing more needs to be said now. The story is still here, and it always will be.